So there came a time in my life in about my late 20s when I realized that my life looked a lot like my parents. I went to bed early. I got up early. I had a prayer routine. I had my day on a schedule. I could meet the responsibilities of work and a family life. I did things like sit in a chair and just peacefully read. Like all of these things that kind of encompass what we would consider adulthood. I was doing all of them, and I was so happy. I loved that my life looked like my parents did when I was young. Now, when I was younger, however, I thought my parents' life was super lame. I would look at them and I would think that I would have more friends, more money, more freedom, and more opportunities, that I would actually make more of my life than they had, that it would be more fun. Right? And that was okay because I wasn't yet an adult. Right? I was actually in adolescence in a time of my life where all of those opportunities and all of that freedom was coming at me, and it was my job to kind of figure out what it looks like to mature through that. But eventually, I got there. Right? And right now, what we're experiencing across our generations is that many people are not actually getting there. I recently read a book by Ben Sasse, who was a senator from Nebraska, and it's called The Vanishing American Adult. And he is saying, and many people agree, that we are coming into a crisis of coming of age in America. Right? That this thing called adolescence was actually meant to be a transition from childhood into adulthood, and it is a beautiful thing, and it is a good thing, and it is necessary. But the transition itself should end. And eventually, we should come out becoming who we were made to be, which is someone who can handle the adult responsibilities of life. And he said that adolescence is actually a protective greenhouse that older generations give to younger generations, in which they look like adults, but they're not held to the same standards as an adult. And he said, the longer that adolescence goes, the more it becomes a trap. Now, recently, one of my daughters was telling me about an experiment they're doing in their classroom where they're just watching a cocoon. So metamorphosis is awesome. It's the process of going a caterpillar, makes a cocoon and then comes out a butterfly. And so she was telling me all about this, and I asked her, I said, well, what happens to the caterpillar when it's in the cocoon? And she said, well, Mom, it turns to goo. And I said, really? That's really interesting. And so I fact-checked her, and I looked it up on my smartphone, and sure enough, when a caterpillar is in a cocoon, its entire body breaks down, except for a few organs, and it becomes this like insecty soup. It refashions itself, and then it comes out a beautiful butterfly that is able to fly around, right, from flower to flower, and really bring beauty to nature. And so I just have to wonder what would happen if a bunch of butterflies came and told a bunch of caterpillars that it wasn't worth it to become a butterfly. Right? They said, stay on the ground, stay crawling, it's better, you have better food, you have better friends, you have more freedom. Right? And being a butterfly, it's a total drag. There's too much responsibility. It won't make you happy, right? And it's just too much stress on your life. Stay a caterpillar. Well, what would happen? Either the caterpillar would stay a caterpillar much longer than it was supposed to, and then it becomes the weird 40-year-old caterpillar at the caterpillar party for the young caterpillars, and nobody wants that, or it never leaves the cocoon and it stays this ooey gooey soup. Right? It stays in this awkward transition phase, and it never becomes what it was meant to be, which is this butterfly that can fly around and has true freedom, no matter how hard it fought to get that freedom. And it's the same thing for us, right? We're children, we have this transitional time of adolescence, but we were made to grow into adults. We were made to become fully mature, right? And so in the Gospels, right, Jesus makes us a promise. He says, the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, but I came that you would have life and you would have it abundantly. Well, what is that abundant life? That abundant life is actually the life of God. It's his own blessed life for which he made us. It's a perfect exchange of love between Father, Son, and Spirit, right? And it's the inheritance that he has been giving us throughout all of time and through his church. But the Bible tells us, Paul tells us in the scriptures, that we should become worthy of the calling we've been given. In the book of Hebrews, when it talks about the saints, it says that the world was not worthy of them. And so, like, the message that I want to convey today is that the world is going to tell you how to be immature, right? I actually heard a quote once that said that the world teaches us the habits of anxious and depressed people. And the mental health outcomes have been devastating, right? We live in a society that teaches us how to be anxious and depressed. And I have taken that in the same vein to say the world teaches us how to be immature. Every message coming at us is telling us to put off adulthood. But the gospel message calls us into full maturity so that we can become who God created us to be. We can live in the peace and the order that God has called us to live in. And then we can eventually become the saints that he calls us to be and live forever in heaven with him. So very, very quickly, what are a couple of the traits of immaturity and maturity, and where do they lead? Because we need to know this if we are going to be able to discern what the world is telling us, and we're going to be able to answer the call that God has placed on us to become great. So quickly, a couple of traits of immaturity, or a few traits of immaturity. One, being self-centered, right? The idea that everything is about us. Our life is about us, about our preferences, about our desires, about our happiness and our fulfillment, right? And so much so that we are the only people we can look at, right? And if you think of the Disney movie Snow White, you have two main characters. You have the queen, who only ever looks in the mirror. That's all she ever does, is look in the mirror. And so that's all she can ever see is herself. And then it leads her into like an evilness and almost like a mental illness, because she can't actually interact with the world as it is. Her reality is so small, right? And the world is telling us through our smartphones, through social media, through our selfies, even through our college tracks, like, make it about you, make it your freedom. But the truth is that life is not about you. Your life is about God. And what do I mean by that? I mean that he created everything. He created you, and he created all of it for his glory. He wills your good for his glory, right? And so when we decide that we're actually not really great gods and we get out of the center, it places us in proper order, worshiping him, glorifying him, and then allowing him to give us the good that he wants to give us, right? So one trait of immaturity is selfishness. Maturity is selflessness. Not worrying so much about us, what we look like, what others think about us, who's offending us, our preferences, our desires, our freedoms, instead looking at this great world and saying, how can I be of service? And in that service, finding fulfillment. Quickly, a few more of these traits, right, of immaturity is inability to deal with difficult circumstances, right? There's a story in the Bible about a bunch of brothers, and the favorite brother was Joseph. And his other brothers didn't like him. And so without trying to fix the problem, they just decide to kill him. And one of the older brothers talks them out of killing him. But it's that desire to say, I see it, I hate it, I must get rid of it, I cannot deal with it. Instead of saying, I see it, there's something wrong, and that response is showing something bad in me, and I can actually internally change, or I can maturely, with everybody's good in mind, approach the situation rationally. Right? Another trait of immaturity is this drive to feed our desires and our pleasures, right? Whenever we see it, if we think it's going to feel good, we want it. And actually, another author, Christian Smith, who writes about emerging adulthood, talks about the millennial generation, which is me, and most likely, if you're watching this, the Gen Z generation, and how we are so over-intoxicated, right? Because we have this insatiable desire to feed our passions. And whenever we do that, we become enslaved to the thing that we're trying to please, and we forego the greater good of putting off pleasure, right? And so the mature response is to be able to put off pleasure for a greater good in the long run, to be able to tell yourself no, right? One of the fruits of the Spirit is self-discipline. And one thing that you will not find in our culture is encouragement towards self-discipline. I actually heard recently that you cannot be tempted towards virtue. You can only be tempted towards sin. You have to choose virtue, and a lot of times that comes from telling yourself no. And the last two traits of immaturity and maturity. For immaturity, it's no ability to honor the task at hand. Right? You know you need to study for a test, but you'd rather go out with your friends. You know you need to make this phone call, but you're afraid to make it. You don't want to make it, so you distract yourself. Right? And instead of actually doing the thing that we need to do in the moment, which is really honoring God's call to us in the moment, we put it off and distract ourselves. And there's actually a sin that comes with that. That sin is called achadia. And achadia is really just this shrinking from the call to greatness and doing it at all costs. And so either it's through inactivity and laziness, and I just don't want to do the thing I'm called to, or it's busyness. I'm going to distract myself. I'm going to overcommit myself so I don't need to do the thing that I'm being called to. And the effect of that is sadness and spiritual sloth. I've heard a priest say it's the inability to choose the good. But when we are able to honor the task at hand, it gives us energy to be able to continue on and to continue to build a muscle to handle responsibilities. Right? And so if we will actually follow where these goes, all the traits of immaturity lead to confusion, chaos, and eventually some sort of slavery. But when we will take the high road, when we will look towards God, accept his grace, we never do this alone, accept this mercy, we never do it perfectly, we will come to a place of peace and order and reconciliation. And we have the power to bring unity to those around us and to live a life that has the weight of greatness. So take the call to grow up into Christ, who is the head of the church, and become the saint you are made to be.